Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nassim. It's very good to be with you again, and thank you for having me.
So, today we'll be discussing the shocking self-immolation of a US soldier in protest against Israel's genocide in Gaza. I'm sure many of you have seen the footage. It really is quite horrific. So, we will be talking about that. The ICJ court hearing on the legality of Israel's occupation. I'll get Moin's thoughts on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan for a post-war Gaza. The PA, amidst all this, is undergoing a cabinet reshuffle. Why now? Seems strange they're doing that right now. US intelligence is casting doubt on Israeli claims about UNRWA staff taking part in 7 October attack. We'll be looking into that. US again last week vetoed another Security Council resolution. What can states do to overcome the paralysis in the Security Council? And Blinken overturned Pompeo doctrine. That's a verdict designation passed during the Trump era. He overturned that, saying that Israeli settlements in the West Bank are inconsistent with international law. Is this too little, too late? So we have lots to get through, Maureen, but I want to begin with the shocking image of the self-immolation of US active serviceman Aaron Bushnell. The 25-year-old dressed in US military attire stood outside the Israeli embassy and set himself on fire in protest against the genocide in Gaza. He literally said that I do not want to be complicit in a genocide in Gaza. And we know from history that this type of extreme protest has had dramatic impact. Remember the Buddhist monk in 1963, which changed the course, some would say, of the Vietnam War and the escalated protests in US. And more recently, Mohammad Bouazizi in 2010, whose self-immolation sparked waves of protests in the Middle East, which came to be known as the Arab Spring. So what are the chances of Aaron Bushnell's death having a similar impact?
Well, let me start by expressing my condolences to Aaron Bushnell's family. It's genuinely tragic that someone in the prime of his life, I believe he was only 25 years old, has given his life as an active protest to a genocide, which his government is actively complicit in. This should have never happened on so many levels. I do think it's a politically potentially very significant development. You mentioned the self-immolation of the Buddhist monk in Ho Chi Minh City, then Saigon, in 1963. Yes, that took place in Vietnam. This event took place in Washington, D.C., the capital city of the United States. And so it has a potential to have a much more direct impact on US public opinion, on people who may perhaps not have been particularly informed or engaged with this issue and will now want to learn more. And this, this individual who undertook this act yesterday was an active service member of the U.S. military, I believe, of the Air Force. And the military in the U.S., as it does in so many countries, has a kind of hallowed, sacred status, if you will. And I think his words and action will be taken more seriously than perhaps it would have if conducted by others. I think it's significant in the following way, that if you look at the US political system, particularly in the last 4 or 5 decades, support for Israel has always been a winner. When in doubt, praise Israel and spew racism against Palestinians, against Arabs, against Muslims. It's consistently been a path to electoral success and electoral victory in the United States. I think we're seeing that may slowly be beginning to change. In recent weeks, we've heard a lot about Biden's increasing electoral troubles in Michigan. Michigan, a toss-up state with a consensus developing that if Biden fails to win Michigan in the upcoming presidential elections, it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for him to win the presidential election. And it would really be a first if we're now in a situation where candidates are not winning but losing elections because of their blind support for Israel and where their callous disregard of Palestinian rights, of Palestinian lives, where their active complicity in the most severe human rights violations against the Palestinian people end up costing them rather than benefiting them. And I think it's in this general context that we should also see this tragic event of yesterday. Uh, Aaron Bushnell was very clear. It's recorded on video. I no longer want to be complicit in the genocide that my government is involved in. Free Palestine, and so on. Of course, he will be delegitimized and demonized as a mentally unstable anti-Semite and a kook and all the rest of it. But it's becoming increasingly difficult to cover up. I'm not sure that we're at the point where an individual single action like this can be described as a turning point. But at some point, I think, when the history of the U.S. role and U.S. complicity in the genocidal onslaught in the Gaza Strip is written, this will be a prominent place, and it will be measured against, Daddy, what did you do during the war?
So, I mean, events like this, of course, forces everyone to ask questions, especially those who are either on the fence or on the other side. Basic questions like, am I really on the right side here? If this person can take such an extreme measure in protest against the US government, and he's not just any average person, he's a soldier, and he's done what he's done. So it forces you to ask questions at least, and we'll see where that goes. And one of the things Bushnell was protesting against, in his own words, is that he did not want to be complicit in a genocide
Exactly.
in Gaza. And talking about genocide this week, of course, the ICJ will be hearing from Israel about what it's done to uphold the provisional measures it issued in January last month in the genocide case, in addition to the case that was heard beginning of last week on Monday. As many as 50 states gave evidence and statements, overwhelmingly on the side of the Palestinians, declaring Israel's occupation as being illegal. So there's two hearings. So if you can just comment on both of them. In the case of last week's hearing, which of the interventions have really been memorable for you? Which arguments have struck you the most? And also say a bit about Israel's reporting back this week on the genocide case specifically.
Well, let's take the genocide case first, because I think that's much simpler and more straightforward. As you'll recall, on the 26th of January, the court issued its provisional rulings in response to South Africa's application against Israel pursuant to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The court had a basic choice to make in its ruling last month, which is to either say that South Africa had not presented a compelling case, and therefore that's the end of it, and there will be no further action undertaken by the court, or, and as it did, decide that South Africa had presented a sufficiently compelling case that Israel may indeed be perpetrating genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, and on that basis, order a number of provisional measures and proceed to a full hearing. In other words, what we saw these dramatic scenes at the ICJ in The Hague last month was, call it a pretrial hearing, if you will, on the basis of which the court, with an overwhelming majority, decided that a full trial now needs to take place. In the meantime, on the 26th of January, it issued its order for provisional measures, in which Israel was instructed to undertake a number of measures. And in addition to that, Israel was instructed to report back to the court within 30 days, in other words, on the 26th of February, to inform the court of how it had indeed implemented the provisional measures ordered by the court. My understanding is that the Israeli document submitted to the court will not be made public. I could be wrong on that, but my understanding is that the court is not under an obligation to make that document public. And I'm also a little unclear about whether South Africa will have a right of reply to that document. But I think the key issue here is that we have essentially seen absolutely no change in Israeli conduct in the Gaza Strip since the 26th of January. If anything, there has been, on the one hand, an intensification of the Israeli onslaught, and at the same time, the threat now of a major invasion of Rafah, where approximately 1.5 million Palestinians have fled, seeking safety from the systematic bombardment of the other regions within the Gaza Strip. And the court essentially has several options. It can either decide that Israel has submitted an acceptable report, and therefore no further action will be taken, and the case will continue to be heard. The court can take a position that Israel's report is unsatisfactory and emphasize once again Israel's obligation to implement the provisional measures that it announced on the 26th of January, and demand that Israel, after a certain period, another 30 or 40 or whatever days, report again. And the court also has the option, if it is sufficiently unsatisfied with Israel's report, to order additional provisional measures. Certainly possible, but not necessarily likely. And I think the court will probably issue its response within a week or two. So that's the genocide case. And recall, the genocide case was initiated by South Africa in late December. The other case is more long-standing, and its origins are a resolution by the United Nations General Assembly, essentially the international community, referring a question to the ICJ, which again is the highest legal authority on the planet, asking it for what is termed an advisory opinion. In other words, this second case is not one in which a particular state or a group of states have sued Israel, so to speak, in front of the World Court. Rather, the international community as a whole, by a clear majority vote in the General Assembly, has asked the International Court to examine the question of the legal status of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And the reason for this is that these territories have, since 1967, been commonly known as the occupied Palestinian territories. Occupied territories, as distasteful as it may be, is a recognized and legitimate status under international law. In other words, it is not by definition illegal or illegitimate to occupy foreign territory in the context of an armed conflict. But to maintain the status of occupied territory, a number of criteria are required. First and foremost, the occupation must be temporary. Secondly, the occupation, you cannot undertake measures of permanent annexation. Third of all, there has to be a good faith effort to reach a political resolution that will also put an end to the occupation and resolve the status of these territories. And the question before the court is whether the measures that Israel has undertaken in these territories since 1967, such as the widespread establishment of what are intended as permanent civilian illegal settlements in these territories, such as the annexation of territories such as East Jerusalem, the Latrun salient, and elsewhere, and whether any number of other measures that Israel has taken mean that this can no longer be considered an occupied territory under international law, but rather what we are dealing with is a question of illegal annexation. And this past week, the court held hearings in which, as you note, approximately 50 states asked to provide submissions to the court explaining why they felt that the court should rule one way or the other or not rule at all. And a few of the submissions I thought really stood out to finally answer your question. First of all, I felt the Palestinians gave an exceptionally compelling and detailed presentation, making very clear that Israel, from its perspective, is there to stay and stay forever, that Israel is treating these territories as if they are sovereign Israeli territories, and therefore it is violating some of the fundamental principles of international law and the UN Charter, such as a prohibition on the acquisition of territory by war, such as implanting its own population into into these territories, such as practicing apartheid against the population of these territories, and so on and so forth. And I felt personally that they made a very compelling case. It's all there to view or to read on the website of the International Court of Justice, and I think those who'd be interested in learning more would do well to consult it. The other one that stood out for me was the Chinese submission, because China, whose relationship to the Middle East has been primarily economic, and has sought to maintain significant economic relations with virtually all players, from Iran to Saudi Arabia to Israel and Egypt and so forth, this time came out and made a statement that, if I'm not mistaken, no other state that presented to the ICJ did, in which it explicitly stated that under international law, the Palestinian people have the right to resist Israeli rule and have the right to armed resistance against Israeli rule, and that at the same time, Israel cannot invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter to claim self-defense in military operations against those that it occupied. So on the one side, those were the two that stood out. On the other side, you had the usual rogues gallery, the United States, the United Kingdom, I believe Germany, and a few other European states, basically asking the International Court of Justice to ignore the request it received from the international community, to refuse to issue a ruling, and to effectively permit Israeli rule in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, to proceed indefinitely in the way that Israel sees fit. And I thought the United States made a particularly disingenuous argument by saying that any eventual Israeli withdrawal from any of this territory must be measured against Israeli security interests, as if the permanent occupation of this territory could be a legitimate Israeli security interest, um, without any effort to define what that security interest might be. And those familiar would know that under the Israeli definition of Israeli security, basically it can do anything and everything at once, attach security as a label, and the US will rush to its aid and defense. And additionally, the US, even more disingenuously, tried to make the argument that this is a political and not a legal matter, and that it should be addressed in, for example, the United Nations Security Council, where, of course, the US has issued dozens of vetoes precisely to ensure that it is not addressed by the United Nations Security Council, and then also referred to the need for political negotiations, as if, we don't recognize that the US has exercised exclusivity and hegemony over the supervision of Middle East diplomacy over the past 3 or 4 decades, and done so in a manner that a former senior American diplomat, Aaron David Miller, characterized the US as Israel's lawyer. So in other words, the US position was the ICJ shouldn't get involved, leave it to us without mentioning, and we will make sure nothing happens.
Based on what you said at the beginning of the ICJ second case, it seems like this is almost a slam dunk case. Occupation by their nature needs to be temporary. There should be a good faith attempt to leave the occupation. And instead, what we've seen, as many human rights organizations have said, Israel has imposed an apartheid system, which by its very nature makes the occupation illegal. And also, what's interesting here is that, unlike the ICJ genocide case, Israel has not defended itself, chose not to defend itself. So it seems like Israel has resigned to the fact that maybe it's just going to lose this case. There is no way of defending its occupation within under the guise of international law, and probably just ignore it and continue as usual as it's done with the ICJ verdict on the 2004 wall. So that's probably where it seems to be heading.
Well, I'm not sure what Israel's thinking was. Of course, in the 2004 West Bank wall case, Israel boycotted the proceedings, and the result was an overwhelming defeat for Israel. In the genocide case, by contrast, Israel actively presented a defense. Of course, it failed to get the case dismissed, but Israel did actively engage with the court. In this case, by contrast, what you see is that Israel, as you mentioned, did not make a presentation to the court, but apparently it did provide a written communication to the court indicating that these proceedings are biased and probably anti-Semitic and all the rest of it as well. I think Israel's strategy in this case has probably less to do with a conviction that they're fighting a losing battle, but more to do with seeking to delegitimize the proceedings as a whole. In other words, and as Israel always likes to say, the United Nations are a bunch of Nazis. The General Assembly is basically an anti-Semitic gathering. International law is a terrorist instrument, and so on. And so by not engaging actively when the ruling is made, and if it indeed does go against Israel, Israel can then claim, well, these proceedings were so illegitimate and biased from the outset that we chose not to participate and to use their non-participation as an effort to delegitimize the proceedings. If I can just make one more point, of course, in the genocide case, Israel as a state was being directly dragged before the court by another state pursuant to a convention, the Genocide Convention, to which Israel is a signatory. This case is a little bit different. Israel is not directly a party to the proceedings in the sense that the court has been asked to offer an opinion on an issue by the international community as a whole. The UN General Assembly did not, let's say, directly engage with Israel the way South Africa did. Rather, the General Assembly engaged directly with the court, put a legal question before it, and asked it to offer an opinion on that question.
Let's turn our attention now to Gaza itself. Today is the 20, well, yesterday was 26th February, International Day for Justice for Palestinian Journalists. And I wanted to mark that occasion by getting your thoughts on that. By every metric we know, the Israeli aggression on Gaza has been the deadliest. The number of journalists killed in Gaza exceeds anything we've ever seen. Over 100 journalists have been killed in Gaza. Other metrics like the percentage of a number of people that are dead, the rate of the death toll in Gaza. We are now seeing Israel blocking aid. Only 50% of aid is allowed to enter Gaza. Level of destruction, civilian death toll, everything exceeds anything we've seen in recent history. So if by every metric, and you know what explains that? And one of the things when I think about this is that when Israel says it's only targeting Hamas, there's an opinion that Israel actually believes all Palestinians are Hamas, all Palestinians are terrorists. And that's the only way you can explain this level of destruction, this level of death, this number of journalists being killed. And that seems to be the only real explanation. What do you think of that?
Yes, I mean, you know, when international associations of journalists and federations and so on are unanimously stating that the past 5 months in the Gaza Strip has been the deadliest conflict for journalists on record, that really leaves open only one of three possibilities. The first, which I think can be categorically dismissed, is that these journalists are actually not journalists, but were killed in active hostilities because they were fighters hiding behind journalistic credentials. No one takes that argument seriously. The second is that journalists are being deliberately targeted by Israel. And the third is that the general population is being deliberately targeted, and that this accounts for the extraordinarily high number, unprecedented number of journalists being killed by the Gaza Strip, by Israel in the Gaza Strip. And my sense is that it's a combination of these two explanations. We have a number of cases in which it's quite clear that journalists and or their families have been deliberately targeted by Israel in order to silence them. And we have other cases in which journalists, often together with their families, have been killed in these kinds of, you know, by Israel treating the Gaza Strip as one big killing fields and indiscriminately bombing anything that moves. I would like to make one more observation here, is the extraordinary silence of much of the world's media and many of the world's leading journalists about this unprecedented attack on the profession and the unprecedented death toll among their colleagues. Imagine if this was Russia um, uh, conducting a similar level of killings of journalists in Ukraine, for example, or if this had taken place in the Balkans or anywhere else. We would be reading about it nonstop. Awards would be issued left, right, and center. There would be special programs and special investigations in every major Western media organization. But what we've had here is often, at most, an acknowledgement that yet another journalist has lost his life, usually passively lost his life. We're often not told how they lost their life, and more importantly, we're often also not told who ensured that they're no longer alive. So it really is, I think, a very disturbing stain on the profession as a whole, the way they've dealt with this. And of course, Western governments have taken the position through word and deed that Palestinians are essentially irrelevant human scum. But I find it more disturbing to see so many of within the Western media essentially taking the position that their murdered colleagues are irrelevant human scum. It really is a stain on the profession. And I should add, it's not like this is the first time that journalists are being killed by Israeli forces. We've had very well-known cases of both Palestinian journalists, most notably Shireen Abu Akleh a year or two ago, an American citizen in which the American government, led by Anthony Blinken, essentially whitewashed and covered up the Israeli crime. And we've had cases also, of course, of foreign journalists being either shot and injured, such as Anthony Shadid in 2002, or Tom Herndal, the photographer who was shot dead by a sniper. So there's a real history here.
Mm.
Um,
So staying on the issue of journalists, death of journalists. So we know Israel has blocked foreign journalists from entering into Gaza. So it almost assumes, or seems like that the decision was made in anticipation of the fact that Israel knows it's going to kill hundreds and hundreds of journalists. And the outrage of that, if it was a foreign journalist, if it was a British journalist or an American journalist or someone else, would have been exponentially way more than what it is currently. It's in a way to avoid further escalation from the international community. Obvious outrage is the reason why Israel prevents foreign journalists from entering into Gaza.
well, thanks for mentioning that, because of course the other aspect here is that we are relying almost exclusively or exclusively on Palestinian reporters and journalists to understand what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And I should say, overwhelmingly, they're doing a phenomenally outstanding job under impossible circumstances. They're suffering the same depredations that the general population is suffering. They're having to deal not only with their personal safety and well-being, but also that of their families and so on. Many of them, perhaps even most of them, have lost loved ones or friends or colleagues. But the point is that, as you mentioned, the foreign media is categorically denied access to the Gaza Strip, not by the Palestinians, but by Israel, of course, unless they go on some of these, embedded tours where they're shown what Israel wants them to see and nothing else. And imagine if the situation was reversed. Every news report on CNN, on BBC, in The Guardian, and the other major Western media, would start at least with an acknowledgement that this report has been produced under circumstances where, you know, journalists have been denied access by the authorities. But in this case, it's never even mentioned. It's never even mentioned. It's almost like a cover up. And not only that, you know, we now have this scandal at the New York Times, where the individual that they assigned to cover a number of critical stories, these allegations of mass rape, UNRWA, and so on. I'm saying the individual they assign, not because we're not talking here about a trained journalist who had been practicing the profession for many years. Um, this is apparently her first job. This person was such a fanatic, radical extremist, that social media posts that she liked were actually referenced by South Africa in The Hague to demonstrate Israel's intent to commit genocide in the Gaza Strip. I mean, it's you know, it's called American Pravda for a reason.
Yeah, we have a question. I have a question about verification later on when we get to UNRWA and the journalists. So we'll speak a bit more about that. But before we do that, I want to ask you about Benjamin Netanyahu's plan for the day after, as it's called.
Mm.
Part of his plan is to demilitarize Gaza and close UNRWA. That's just some of his proposal, which seems to be really far from what the US wants. So, what do you suspect will be the eventual scenario? Will we have Netanyahu's plan or the US plan, which suppose seems to be something that's being cooked up with Arab countries as well?
Well, for either, indeed, for any plan that is not endorsed by the Palestinians to be implemented, one of two things will have to happen. Either Hamas and the other Palestinian armed groups in Hamas in the Gaza Strip will need to be decisively defeated, or the population of the territory will need to be expelled. And at this stage, it doesn't seem like a foregone conclusion that either will be happening. I think if you look at what's referred to as Netanyahu's plan, you know, what is it called? So, you know, collaborators assigned to administer various regions within the Gaza Strip, re-education camps for the Palestinians so that they can all become good Zionists and sing Hatikva when they wake up every morning. Getting rid of UNRWA because, of course, these Palestinians are, you know, ignorant, naked savages who don't have a thought in their head unless it's placed in there by UNRWA. And it's only because of UNRWA that they believe they are refugees and that they believe they have rights, and so on. And you know, it's not serious. It's not a plan. It's a placeholder to ensure that Israel retains permanent control of the Gaza Strip on its own terms. And I would also argue that the Israeli agenda remains to find an opportunity to force out at least a significant part of the population of the Gaza Strip. As far as the US is concerned, yes, the US has different priorities. The US would prefer a different formula. But in the end, is the US going to confront Israel about anything? Certainly about this, and do so during an election year? I don't think so. You know, Biden, Blinken, McGurk, these people are totally invested in Israel and its agenda. I mean, you have a president of the United States who proclaims himself to be a Zionist, and who has demonstrated himself actually to be not only a Zionist, but a Likudnik, and the key ally of Smotrich and Ben Gvir. Is this a type of administration that is going to face down Israel, that is going to confront it over policies that they don't like or disapprove of, and force Israel into a different course of action? There's no evidence for that.
Yeah, I think despite what the Americans say, I think one thing we can be sure of is that whatever formula they come up with is one that will deny Palestinians self-rule and self-determination. It will be another version of the same old,
Yes.
colonial placeholder, colonial model arrangement. That's what it's going to be, but with different emphasis. And another question related to that, or another development related to that, is the Palestinian, the Prime Minister of the PA, Mohammed Shataya, he submitted his resignation. And I'm wondering whether this is part of paving the way for the day after, as it's called. 'Cause a lot of people, it seems, in the middle of a genocide, this is a bit overindulgent. Why is he resigning now? Is he resigning because of the insistence of Washington? What's happening?
Well, there's two explanations for that. Of course, Mohammed Shtaya has been the Palestinian prime minister since 2019, and he has been prime minister of a divided government, if you will. You had the Palestinian Authority government in the West Bank, and you had the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. And so his resignation, I think, um, reflects one or two scenarios. The first is that Shtaya's government and the government in the Gaza Strip would resign on the basis of an agreement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and other Palestinian factions to establish a new consensus government, either a coalition government or a so-called technocratic government, or an independent government that is supported by both parties. That would be one explanation. The second explanation, and I think by far the more likely one, is that the United States has informed Mahmoud Abbas that it wants a different government to prepare to play a role in post-war Gaza Strip. And of course, the key criteria here is that this is a government that should be selected by Americans, not by Palestinians, and that its prime minister should be appointed by Americans, not Palestinians, and that the policies of this government should be dictated by Americans and not Palestinians. Americans, of course, acting to the extent that Israel accepts that they do so, acting on behalf of Israel and not on behalf of the Palestinian people. And of course, a key criteria for the next Palestinian prime minister is that he has no popular legitimacy among his own people. He needs to have legitimacy in Washington, not in Gaza or Ramallah or Nablus. And the person who's being proposed for this role by the Americans is Mohammed Mustafa. He's the head of the Palestine Investment Fund. He's essentially Abbas's bagman. And the idea, this is what the Americans call reform, what they call revitalizing the Palestinian Authority, what they call preparing the Palestinian Authority to play a role in the Gaza Strip. So it's all a charade and smoke and mirrors and an exercise in futility. Of course, Abbas once again has gone along with this. He has essentially sacrificed his own government, his own prime minister, to make way for yet another American initiative whose explicit purpose is to further undermine Palestinian rights and the prospects for Palestinian national reconciliation. Again, I think the only constructive outcome of Shtaya's resignation would be if it were to make way for a consensus government, one that enjoys the endorsement of all the main Palestinian political forces. That is the only one that could have any hope of achieving both Palestinian popular legitimacy and play a role in the Gaza Strip. But I don't see that that's on the agenda of either Abbas or his sponsors in Washington and Brussels.
I mean, two important stories from last week, one related to UNRWA and another related to a UN report on sexual violence of Palestinian women by Israelis. US intelligence has cast doubt to the Israeli claims of UNRWA Hamas links. I think many of us have doubts over that. Now the US intelligence has cast doubt over that. And same week, there was a report that sexual violence against Palestinians by the Israelis is much higher than first thought. So what struck me, again, this goes back to the question about verification, how US newspapers and the White House has become virtually a mouthpiece for Israeli propaganda. You had a scenario in the White House where the spokesperson was asked about the sexual violence against Palestinian women. And he responded by saying that they've not had any they've not been able to verify the reports, so they cannot comment. Now contrast that with the reports of rape, with the reports of 44 beheaded babies. All those were reported by Israeli sources. Despite that, Blinken and other US officials spread those lies without any verification. So it seems like, US will only verify if it's not from Israelis, whereas whatever the Israelis say, there doesn't seem to be any doubt in their mind and any reason for them to verify those reports, even though to everyone else it seems completely untrue and completely used to serve Israeli propaganda.
Yeah. Blinken will never have to answer for his crimes. Blinken will never be held accountable for his actions while in office. Unfortunately, that's the way the world works. But Blinken will go to his grave with the knowledge that when his grandchildren and their children read about Gaza and study the genocide in Gaza, that he will have a central role in it, and that no account of the mass murder in the Gaza Strip will be considered complete unless his role in enabling this and supporting this and cheering it on and giving it facilitation in all kinds of ways. No account that ignores his role will be considered complete. So I wanted to get that out of the way. This is Blinken, who rushed to dismiss South Africa's allegations as meritless before even looking at any of the evidence. And of course, he already knew exactly what was going on. Blinken was the first American official to say, basically, I haven't seen the evidence, but I consider it very, very credible with regard to the Israeli allegations against UNRWA. Blinken and Biden are not themselves neocons, but their policies and positions very closely reflect those of the neocons, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. Blinken has never encountered a war in this region that he hasn't supported or cheered on or tried to facilitate and promote and so on, to a greater extent even than Biden, who, unlike Blinken, had reservations about Libya. But, I think getting back to your question, the US actually collects only limited intelligence itself on these matters. It relies primarily on what it's given by the Israelis. And the Israelis, of course, can manipulate that relationship to their ends. But I think what we're seeing now is perhaps some in the US intelligence community beginning to raise questions about this over-reliance and blind endorsement of anything and everything the Israelis say or claim or allege or conclude. And so you had this assessment by the US intelligence community expressing low confidence in Israel's allegations against UNRWA and its staff. As far as the other part of your question is concerned, you know, this UN report about sexual violence against Palestinian women and girls, if I'm not mistaken, received very little coverage in Western
Sure.
media. Certainly compared to concocted stories about organized, systematic rape a la Bosnia on October 7th, which again, we've now seen that the New York Times, American Pravda, basically appointed a fanatic extremist whose agenda on social media you know, again, posts she liked were used by South Africa in front of the International Court of Justice to demonstrate Israel's intent to commit genocide. These are things she was supporting. But, you know, when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, you can say anything. You can hold any position you want. As long as you're politically correct, there are no boundaries, there are no criteria, there are no requirements. What matters in these media organizations who like to attack everyone else for lacking press freedom and present themselves as kind of a peon and an example for the world to emulate. It's, what matters is not the truth. What matters is what you think.
Extraordinary. Sticking with the US, Tuesday, it vetoed another Security Council resolution urging a ceasefire, calling for a ceasefire. It was the only country to do so, and it's the second time it's vetoed a ceasefire. And
I
I
believe
think,
it's a third, actually.
is it a third? Sorry. Okay. So is it time? A lot of people asking me, is it time for states to think about other avenues, such as what's known as uniting for peace? This is a special emergency measure that can be used when the Security Council is in paralysis like this. Why aren't countries demanding a resolution on the basis of uniting for peace in the General Assembly? Because everyone knows the US will veto any resolution against Israel. Why haven't we seen that yet?
Well, you're entirely correct that within the Security Council, the U.S. As main role is to ensure that the genocide can continue undisturbed. And in fact, the U.S. permanent representative to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, had the audacity to talk about a final solution. Those were her exact words, in explaining why the U.S. Vetoed this resolution. It's really too much for words. As far as uniting for peace is concerned, um, I'm not fully conversant with the details, but I don't think it's a practical alternative to a binding and enforceable resolution adopted by the Security Council. My understanding is that even uniting for peace resolutions issued by the General Assembly do not have a binding and enforceable character. And furthermore, they would require a much broad, and by the way, Uniting for Peace has already been invoked, I believe, on an ongoing basis with respect to the question of Palestine. I think, getting back to your question, rather than looking for alternatives within the framework of the United Nations, we should begin look for alternatives outside the framework of the United Nations. For example, you have this joint Arab League Organization of Islamic Cooperation resolution dating from a few months ago to ensure the entry of humanitarian supplies to the Gaza Strip. Well, it's been honored mainly in the breach, but if interested countries start acting independently, I think the best example here is South Africa's decision to drag Israel before the ICJ on an accusation of genocide. I think once you begin to develop momentum independently of the UN, outside the framework of the UN, and here I'm referring specifically to the Security Council rather than its agencies and so on, then you may find, by no means guaranteed, but you may find that as Washington and for that matter London see the momentum slipping away from the institution which they have the ability to control, that they might begin to gradually change their own attitude so that all these states and governments who are acting independently of the Security Council began to see it as once more a meaningful organ to address these issues. This is, of course, purely speculative, but I think the premise of your question, that the Security Council will not and cannot do anything constructive on Palestine because of US fanaticism, and that therefore we need to look at alternatives. And I would argue those alternatives probably need to be outside rather than within the UN. That would probably be the way to go.
That's good to know. Let's finish on one last question, sticking with Washington and Antony Blinken. Let's cast our mind back to the Trump era when Mike Pompeo, the Foreign Secretary of State at the time, a Christian Zionist, I should add, he issued a declaration basically stating that Israeli settlements are legal and not illegal as is considered under international law. Blinken has overturned that and issued a declaration saying that settlements are indeed illegal and inconsistent with international law. To me, it seems like a move that's too little too late, but also it seems to be issued with an eye in the next election in mind, because there's a growing number of people who are uncommitted, as they say, in the next general election, which could really, really hurt Biden. So do you think it's just another ruse to give something to people who are criticizing Biden, especially American Muslims who are uncommitted, not just Muslims, many, many progressives who are uncommitted now because of Biden and Blinken's support for Israeli genocide? And the most they can do is reverse a declaration which was illegal to begin with. That's the most they can do.
Well, it's interesting that you place this in the context of the upcoming U.S. elections. I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but that could certainly be part of the explanation. In my initial response, or in my initial reflection on this move, I was thinking more about what is happening in The Hague. In other words, the U.S. basically told the court, as far as the international community's request to you to issue an opinion on the legal status of Israeli rule in these territories, this is none of your business. Leave it to us. We'll deal with this. We know how to handle this. Well, this is the same US that had an official position that illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied territories are in fact legal. This is the same US that on the one hand claims to be promoting a two-state settlement, but at the same time, only very recently, voted against a UN General Assembly resolution reaffirming the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, and voted against the resolution because it affirmed the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. You know, this is the same US that in so many respects is more pro-Israel than even Israel itself. And I think it was in this context, partially at least, that the US reversed the so-called Pompeo rule and reverted to the earlier US position that Israeli settlements are not consistent or are inconsistent with international law. It's incapable of coming out and saying these are illegal, these are war crimes under international law, these must be dismantled and removed. No, they're inconsistent with international law, whatever that means. And as you said, too little, too late. But my main takeaway from it was that it was primarily an effort to demonstrate to the International Court of Justice that Washington's views should be taken seriously because it's no longer, you know, because it's taken positions that are at least not inconsistent with previous ICJ rulings on some of these issues, such as the illegality of Israeli settlements. But I think the domestic electoral considerations is quite valid as well. And this goes back to a point we were discussing earlier, that it's very interesting that in 2024, in sharp contrast to decades of US electoral history, pandering to Israel is increasingly becoming a burden rather than a benefit. Now, the other related initiative to this, of course, is the US withholding visas to I think 4 Israeli settlers and taking other measures against them. Again, this is primarily smoke and mirrors, meaningless, you know, when you're supporting the state that is responsible for the settlement policy, but somehow impose sanctions on 4 of the hundreds of thousands of settlers, entirely meaningless. But nevertheless, once again, this is the US seeking to demonstrate that no, we are not more pro-Israel than Israel itself, all appearances aside.
Thank you, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. And thank you for tuning in, folks. See you for another episode of Memos Review with me, Nassim Ahmed. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.